morning, everybody. I'm an industry analyst, so I kind of neither belong here nor there. I'm a participant observer to the world of advertising, and I want to take a step back this morning to really see what is the context in which publishers are operating today, and how can we move programmatic from today to the world of tomorrow. There are three key messages that I want to bring over this morning, conveyed through three key words: ubiquity, asymmetry, and programmability. What do those mean? Ubiquity stands for that the programmatic world is here today and is here to stay, and publishers need to embrace it, come to terms with it to thrive. But as programmatic becomes ubiquitous, we see huge asymmetries emerging as to who wins and who loses and who can best leverage its potential. And lastly, the idea of programmability means finding new formulas for publishers to win by combining data, technology, and strategy. But I want to start with something slightly more morbid. I want to talk about death, and not in the metaphorical sense about the death of print or the death of publishing, but no, in its real brutal primordial sense. What you see here is a death register of 1665 in London, causes of injuries and death. Let's not go into detail. We don't want to know what diseases people had in those days, but you might want to ask, what does this have to do with ad tech? Well, a lot, actually. You see numbers next to those deaths. So this was one of the first means of counting people, of measuring populations. It was through registers of disease and death that the principles of modern statistics were born, to measure things, to get a grasp of what's happening around us, to convert a world of chance into a world of probability. And this gave birth to what you see on the other side, the normal distribution, a core principle of statistics. You see this bell-shaped curve, what is normal and what are the outliers. Now I think we start to get the idea. This is a way, thinking about statistics in this way, that has governed the world of media for more than 100 years. But it was always about getting samples of data and making inferences to the larger population, putting people into boxes, into buckets, and planning media on that basis. ABC1, Housewives, 14 to 49, and so forth. So statistics has always influenced media. Now, we live in an age of pervasive computation, where this logic of statistics that we've seen since the 19th century is being flipped on its head. We always talk about the idea of big data, and we usually think about the three V's, the volume, the velocity, and the variety of data. But that's only half of the story. There are two very important points here if we think about the programmatic future. That is, big data means that data is being collected or being analyzed for purposes other than those that it has been collected for, and that we get rid of the idea of causality, of having an explanation for things, by letting data work out through brutal correlation what matters to us. And this has given rise to a new way of doing advertising, programmatic, or moving away from putting people into boxes, the averages, to addressing individuals, or as marketing professor Joe Turow puts it, moving from the marketing of sameness, similar people, same buckets, to the marketing of difference. And what I want to show you today is that how we apply programmatic today with those philosophical principles in mind is leading us into a trap, into a dead end. And we have to understand that today we are, although the market is growing, facing a growing gap between the practice and the promise of programmatic. Now, it doesn't seem like this in the first place. If you look at these statistics that we recently did around the status quo and the future of programmatic advertising, you can see programmatic is becoming ubiquitous. It's becoming the dominant set of mechanisms to buy, sell, plan, and one word, transact media. We can see it's happening on all different digital formats. I didn't include TV or out of home here, but you can see how programmatic moved out of the confines of desktop display to other formats, to mobile, or even to the more premium and more limited in supply things like video. Now, I must say, in a way, mea culpa, because me as an analyst, it's my job to forecast things. And we as analysts always think about the future, but we can only extrapolate from the present. And you could argue that by 2019, the definition of programmatic will become irrelevant. Because programmatic is growing not only because the market is growing, but because the definition of programmatic is expanding day by day. So the most important thing to take from this slide is programmatic is here to stay. Don't think about the exact numbers for 2019, but think about it as an expanding part of media that publishers need to come to terms with. We live in a programmatic world. But the principles on which this world operates are unevenly distributed. Have a look here at the US versus Europe in 2015. Yes, you see the US is ahead. You can see on the yellow, on the orange bit, traditional, non-API driven planning and buying, revenue generated from there. And then as two buckets, API driven or programmatic advertising, defined here just as automated on the one hand and RTB and auction on the other hand. You see the US is ahead of Europe, but you can also see that Europe isn't really that far behind. But if you fast forward, you can see the gap between Europe and the US is shrinking on the one hand, but you can also suddenly see that the part that is programmatic is unevenly distributed between those two types of market. Clearly, you see that the automated, the non-RTB bit in Europe is larger than in the US proportionately. And a key point why this is the case is because of the role of publishers. European markets are largely publisher-driven markets where, despite a very strong demand side, publishers are lighthouses that aggregate a lot of media inventory. The US is much more distributed, and publishers trying to hedge their inventory, trying to protect their sovereignty, tend to not embrace RTB, auction-based formats, as much as they do modes which allow them to directly, or in some ways much more crudely, control the price of the inventory. But we all know that Europe isn't homogeneous. There are actually 4 different types of markets. I chose the example of video here to illustrate this because video as a premium format really carves out those differences between the markets. You see on the x-axis the compound annual growth rate, so the average growth rate year over year, how those markets are growing. And on the y-axis, you can see the actual share that programmatic video has of the overall online video pie. The size of the bubble is the size of the market. It's unsurprising that the top group is composed of 3 markets, Netherlands, UK, and France. We all know the Netherlands is very tech-driven, very experimental. We know in the UK we have a fantastic infrastructure in place, strong demand side, driving programmatic. France has a homegrown programmatic ecosystem. But you see a middle ground of markets lumped together here. Italy and Spain, where until recently a lot of the infrastructure was still missing. And yet the Scandinavian markets, which took a step back and where publishers took a wait-and-see approach to see how do things pan out, what do the agencies do, and how can we avoid mistakes by just listening in and learning before we deploy programmatic principles ourselves. And you can see on the right side, obviously, markets that are just emerging. So there are 4 types of markets. The 4th type actually is Germany, my native market, if you will, which is a very odd one, because it's the 2nd largest display ad market in Europe, but it's so lagging behind programmatically. And Germany has been blamed for being very conservative about programmatic for a long time, and I think this criticism is only partly justified, because we have to see why are the other markets growing so much. It's because they have adapted specific requirements around programmatic that have largely been set by the demand side. Publishers have built out abilities based on requirements, characteristics, standards, not necessarily defined by them, but for them by others. So I think that these other markets, you see at the bottom here, in Germany, which has had a bit of a wait-and-see approach, actually have a second mover advantage because they waited, publishers are in a stronger position now, and they can build programmatic, potentially, to their own needs, their own demands, and not just being reactive to a very strong buy side that dictates the framework of the market. But within this environment, within all markets, we see no matter who deploys programmatic, how quickly, how much it scales, the growth is highly asymmetrical. Brian mentioned it before in his presentation. We see a growing shift of net ad revenue to closed walled gardens, to audience platform businesses and not to publishers. Granted, publishers take some of that money that is in Google and Facebook here, but it is happening within these walled gardens. And we didn't even include the massive surge of Facebook video in these forecasts. So you can get the picture yourself. The market is growing in Europe, overall programmatic, maybe with a compound annual growth rate of 14, 15%, but the share gains of the large walled gardens are so high that many aren't actually benefiting from this growth, and that some publishers are actually flat or even declining in growth despite the rapid rise of programmatic. Why is this asymmetry really happening? Well, we see a large scale of audience and first-party data. We see a rise of the commodification of media buying. And lastly, we also see that these large platforms are end-to-end and have a completely horizontal and vertical perspective on the market. And not only is growth asymmetric, but really it's the competition that's asymmetric because knowledge is asymmetric. And I give you a couple of minutes to digest this quote by Rob Norman, which I think really summarizes the problem very, very well. So what Rob is really alluding to is that we don't really know what's going on within the black boxes of walled gardens. Often this is related to the idea of data. We have a paradox in digital. We have more data than ever, but less than ever we really know what it means or can agree on a standard. So those who have large sets of data and the ability to process and analyze the data, they also have a claim to a proprietary truth. They define what the data means, and others have to act on that definition. And that's a huge problem. Competition is asymmetric because knowledge is asymmetric, and we can't query those black boxes. So how do publishers compete in this environment where programmatic is ubiquitous, but where spend is increasingly moving into walled gardens? Well, one thing to be clear is we have to think about programmatic in a much wider manner than just about ad tech. You can see here 4 different pillars that constitute the new media ecosystem in which publishers are operating. We see technology, consumers, advertisers, and content. And we can see that between all of those, with the publishers and without the publishers, relationships are established. And increasingly, these relationships are mediated through data at the heart of it. So even if you see brand-funded content partnerships between advertisers and content are increasingly funded by data through analytics and so forth. So what are options for publishers? What are they doing today? Technology. Should publishers become tech companies or ramp up their technological expertise? Now, despite the concentration of ad spend in walled gardens, the tech landscape is actually hyper-fragmented. We just heard some cautionary tales about ad blocking, but for me, in composing this slide, ad blocking was a blessing in disguise because I looked at the tracker lists of different ad blocking software to really see what trackers are out there. And you can see publishers have a plethora of choice. There are more than 3,180 ad and analytics trackers out there on the web today. Now, there are not as many companies, but nearly as much. So for publishers to audit tech vendors, to really do software procurement, becomes incredibly difficult. To make a decision, do I go for an integrated end-to-end solution, or do I go for a point-to-point solution? How do these different technologies communicate with each other? Becomes hugely problematic. How do I query? How do I audit? How do I assess the performance of my partners? How much tech do I really need to have in-house? And how can I do that as a publisher whose business is focused on content? Should you do it through something else, like a coalition? Things that have happened in the past already, and I think which is very distinct when it comes to Europe, a concept that has emerged out of France and other markets for publishers to come together, to bundle insight, to bundle audience, and to bundle inventory. You can see they're hybrids, but around 3 different models of how these coalitions, or often called cooperatives, really work. A participant model, where an ad tech company basically invites publishers to the table, works with them. There's a co-ownership model, where publishers co-own the technology, the infrastructure that powers these coalitions. And lastly, in a hybrid way, an international model where publishers realize that national markets might actually be too small, that we have to scale across Europe or across territories to really take advantage of these economies of scale and analysis that these coalitions afford. Now, there's a problem with these coalitions. They are outsourced from the publisher, and everybody wants to extract value from them. But to keep up with the large tech players, you have to invest constantly, technology, in R&D, and so forth. And how should you really find a good way of investing in a shared asset? So we usually see a linear flow of value out of these coalitions and not really a similar reinvestment back into those coalitions. And you can see, well, even if you embrace these coalitions, asymmetries remain. Here you see some ComScore data around the monthly uniques after the Pangea page, the Pangea launch in March 2015, that even if publishers aggregate audience, there's a huge gap to the large players like Facebook. And this gap, I argue, is actually exponential, because what these coalitions or cooperatives usually do, that they just bundle in an operational manner, the advertising and the data. But they're not really proactive in the sense that they use this data for predictive analytics to really figure out what happens next to inform new business models. So it's a limited option. Others say, okay, let's take the checkbook out. Let's really think of this whole world of programmatic and ad tech as a set of Lego blocks that you can reassemble and build your own ecosystems. And you can see there has been a lot of M&A activity recently. And here's a slide that shows how this has happened in the video space, how different companies have built their stack. And you can see, all of these companies. But you can really see from this slide who the usual suspects are, who have the cash and also who have the ability to integrate these technologies to really make more sense of it. It's the large online platforms. Increasingly, it's also telcos who want to move their access business to an ad business as well to augment that, and very few publishers, largely broadcasters, who have the cash, but also have the large audience reach and really the ability to afford and fund and drive those acquisitions. So it's not a choice for everybody, obviously. But is that really it? Technology, investing in technology, auditing partners, coalitions or acquisitions, or is there another way? And I think actually there is, which I call, to think about the programmatic ability more widely, which is shown on this slide. If we just continue on the track of programmatic that we have today, in a black-boxed world of walled gardens, we see an increasing shift of value away from media or those who control the eyeballs, the publishers, to the value of the intermediaries. So I outline on this slide two different futures. Future one, the black box future, and future two, the transparent future. In the black box future, the ad ecosystem is boxed and closed, and publishers are largely reactive to the demands of advertisers and to the structural definitions of the market for the large platforms. In the transparent futures, publishers work together in a network way, and we have an open ecosystem. So how do you move from the black box future, which we're veering towards today, to this transparent future? I think there are 4 different steps that you can take. Innovation acceleration. So think about plug-and-play standards to reduce technological barriers between publishers, between systems, to enable non-technical roles within the publisher to do more with programmatic principles. And I know I've been slightly morbid this morning, but technology forensics, try to reverse engineer the black box. Try to figure out what's going on behind these closed systems. Use technology to listen in and figure out and optimize. Lastly, machine learning and performance optimization. The infrastructures of advertising that we have today are not infrastructures where something goes from A to B, but they're networked infrastructures, and they're performative, meaning they change all the time. So you can apply machine learning or different concepts coming out of the idea of big data analysis that I outlined earlier to really try to figure out how do these infrastructures work, how can I optimize them, how can I perfect my business model on the basis of that. And that lastly, I think, can really lead to a different financial impact that programmatic can make through transparent attribution of value and the capture of much more value than what's happening today. So let me conclude. We are moving from a world where programmatic is ubiquitous and asymmetrical to a world where publishers need to completely rethink how they employ it to not fall into the programmatic dead end. And I think that can be summarized with the idea of programmability. Start to program or start to build the ability to program your own future through data-driven thinking rather than be reactive to it. So the diagnosis is clear. Programmatic is ubiquitous, asymmetrical, and there's no clear path yet for publishers to win. But let's go back to the roots. Let's go back to my first slide around about the deaths in London and try to understand, to leverage the difference between the programmatic practice today, just media buying, to the promise of programmatic, of the principles of programmatic thinking that can really ingest something new to your business. Also, program or be programmed. Slightly polemically, the media scholar Douglas Rushkoff said to people today, if you want to succeed, if you want to remain competent citizens, you need to learn to code or you will be programmed by others. The same somehow applies to media companies as well, to publishers. You need to move away from just being kind of, adhere to the requirements of the demand side to really have a more creative, publisher-centric approach that has your interests at heart, start from a blank slate. Unchain programmatic, or move programmatic out of the confines of the ad sales department and move it, deploy these ideas and practices much more widely across your organization. Bring data from the margins to the center of the organization, use machine learning, algorithmic exploration and so forth across very different business units and connect them together. And lastly, move computation out of the box into the environment. Work with others, learn through the programmatic systems, define new business models in collaboration with others in an open infrastructure. And I want to conclude with that today, and thank you very much.